Hi, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for all being here today, and huge thanks to Collins for setting it up. So yeah, my name is Joanne Owen, and I'm here today to share practical ideas for collaborative projects that will help inspire a sense of writing for pleasure in students. So we'll cover things like creative writing, things like short stories, and we'll cover factual articles as well. As the title says, this is all about writing for purpose to enhance writing for pleasure. But really, this kind of came about because I think there's been a lot of focus, rightfully so, on the importance of reading for pleasure, but there hasn't been really yet quite the same focus on writing for pleasure and actually practically how to foster that sense of writing for pleasure. And yet the written word and written communication in all its forms, whether that's through novels, fictions, writing book reviews or writing great news articles, is such a vital part of people's lives. So the idea is today that the projects I'll run through will help make writing pleasurable. In essence, it's all about how to make writing fun, how to make writing something students want to do, as opposed to something that they're told to do. So I'll just really quickly run through a little bit of my background. As you've just heard, I'm a writer for children. I also review children's books, and I've got a background in children's publishing. And so really my professional life has always been centred around reading for pleasure and also delivering workshops in schools that seek to inspire writing for pleasure. So I've worked in children's books, I've worked for a number of different publishers. I've worked on some community-based projects for the National Literacy Trust, which is a UK literacy charity that's committed to champion reading and writing for pleasure. And I'm also an editorial expert for a children's book recommendation website. In terms of what I've written, one of my fairly recent series is for young fiction, an illustrated series called Martha Mayhem, which is kind of really all about fun. And I do lots of workshops around writing for pleasure based on those. I've written a few old novels for slightly older readers, kind of 11, 12-year-olds. And these are kind of inspired by legends and mythology. And most recently, I've written a guide, which is basically a guidebook to writing for pleasure, published by Collins. It's called You Can Write Awesome Stories. And really, this is a practical guidebook, and I'll be using some examples from this as we go through today's presentation. It has lots of information about the nuts and bolts of writing, lots of fun, practical activities, really based on the ethos that anyone can write and that writing is a pleasurable activity, which of course is the ethos underpinning today's presentation. And really a lot of the content of You Can Write Awesome Stories was inspired by workshops and events that I've done with students over the years. And really all of these events are delivered from a writing for pleasure perspective. I try through the workshops and through the examples that we'll go through today, I try to show that writing is a fab form of communication. It's a way of self-expression, a way for students to show who they are. The workshops and again the activities we'll go through today also try to foster a sense of the satisfaction that comes from something unique. Nobody else can write the same story as you, so I really try to emphasise that to students. Again, it's about making something personal. It's a form of self-expression. One other area I like to cover is to foster a sense of collaboration to show how writing can be social. And finally, I also try to foster motivation from the sense of agency that writing gives, especially when you have an audience and a sense of purpose. So really all of this is underpinned to what I would say is my mantra, which is that writing for pleasure goes hand in hand with writing for purpose, which leads me on to explaining how collaborative projects foster writing for pleasure and the benefits of writing pleasure, because I guess we kind of need to frame this in why we're doing it, why it's important. And I think these reasons are threefold. Firstly, projects provide a sense of purpose. Having a sense of purpose makes writing more pleasurable. Writing being more pleasurable leads to improved writing and communication skills. Secondly, these project-based ideas that we'll go through show that writing can be collaborative. Writing is often really a solitary activity, or it's seen as a solitary activity, something you do on your own, something you're told to do and you go off and do without really chatting to your friends or without collaborating. So I really want to show through these projects the value of collaborative working, the value of peer-to-peer advice, peer-to-peer encouragement, the power of being part of something bigger and being part of a team to create something for a purpose. And finally, one key thing about projects is they can provide students with agency. If they have control and they make choice about what they're writing about, they make choice about the contents of those projects, that will hopefully lead to more engagement with the project, which will lead to them enjoying the project more, which ultimately will improve their writing and communication skills. And hopefully that will it will move beyond the project. So all of those skills, it's basically being equipped with a skill set that can go across the curriculum and actually also really importantly across their wider lives. So for each of the projects I'll go through, I'll give an overview what the project is and who the audience might be. And I think really having an audience and a sense of the audience is really key to what makes projects such a great way of fostering writing for pleasure. It's important to give students a sense of being aware who they're writing for, because writing will be informed by who the audience is. It will inform the content and it will also inform how you write, the style of writing. I'll also give a run through of the components with suggestions for what each project might include, although to come back to that, the importance of agency, students will have the final say. And for each of them, I'll also cover practical activities with some ideas for where you can develop writing skills that are pertinent to the particular project. Talking of which, these are the 7 projects we'll hopefully get to go through. Firstly, creative writing and a book-themed magazine that you could do as a class or across the school. Then leading on from that, a school literary festival, then a school newspaper, a school handbook for new starters, also creating a new travel guide, and then kind of expanding across the curriculum a bit. We can use some of the activities and the framework that we've covered previously to look at creating historic documents, newspapers and magazines based in different time periods. And then finally, we look at competitions and how you can adapt entering writing competitions to fulfill that writing for pleasure aim. So firstly, we'll kick off with probably the most obvious one, excuse me, which is a creative writing and book themed magazine. So the overview of this in terms of what it's for, firstly, most obviously, it's to showcase students' creative writing, whether that's short stories, poetry or comic strips. Secondly, it's enabling students to share information about books and authors they love. In terms of the audience, it will be their peers. So if you do it for the class, it might be other classes, it'll be parents, it might be other schools. This could be a great one that you could kind of open it up to schools in your areas. And maybe the local community, if you get local press on board, which is kind of a nice way, a nice extra way to make the project have a bigger audience and to give it more purpose. In terms of content ideas, the creative writing, short stories, which we'll cover in a moment, also poems, comic strips. And then I'd also like to introduce some activities around critical writing. So we also cover that. And I think this is a great way to show how these projects can actually integrate equipping students with skills and passion for those skills for different types of writing. So creative writing and critical writing. And then also what I would do as a starting point for this project is to collectively develop the content ideas. So in essence, you'll have those 2 strands, creative and critical writing. And from that, I would have a class discussion so kids can actually decide the nuts and bolts about what they want to include to give them that sense of agency. Moving on from that, once they've kind of got some ideas, I would ask students to name the magazine, again, giving them that agency. And once they've named it, they can come up with more content around that name and thinking more about what they want to write about. So really, it's all about giving students support, giving them a toolkit so they're able to fulfill as much of the project pretty independently. So with that in mind, I'm just going to now run through a few practical activities to help students get up and running with their creative writing. And let's start at the beginning. Often the thing I hear a lot with certain students in workshops is that problem of overcoming the fear of the blank page, not knowing what to write in the first place. And I think that can be a problem where it's great to give a sense of agency, but at the same time, if you leave things too open-ended, it can actually be really, really tricky to find that spark of inspiration. I sort of hear, I don't know what to write, I can't think anything of right. So I'm just going to share a couple of activities to help with sparking inspiration in the first place. Right, one activity I use quite often in workshops, and I'll deliver a whole hour or 2 hour session around this, is what I call the Every Object Tells a Story activity. And basically in my own workshops, I use personal context to show how this activity translates to real life, to show how a real book has actually come from using an object as inspiration. So for example, I will kind of bring objects to the sessions, and I'll say, for example, how Czech marionettes inspired my first novel, Puppet Master, which is set in Prague. Then I might also say how one of my other novels, Circus of the Unseen, was inspired by myths around Russian dolls and the magic of Russian dolls as objects. And then I might show some masks from, this inspired one of my Martha Mayhem books called Martha Mayhem and the Balmy Birthday. And I'll sort of explain to them that these objects really form the basis for those 3 books, and I'll show the books so they can see the real life relevance of it. And related to that, I'd also mention, which I think is quite a useful thing that runs across whether you're writing creative short stories or actually if you're developing factual articles, I like to frame this object activity in terms of writers being a bit like archaeologists or a bit like explorers. They dig up ideas and they discover stories through objects. That's quite a nice way I find to frame it. In terms of the practical activity, I will usually start off in a collaborative way, which is something you'll see running through this whole presentation. So I'll show students a selection of objects, might be some of the stuff that I've just shown you here now. Other things that work well could be old maps, postcards, cuttings from newspapers, various ornaments, jewellery, just bits and bobs that might be intriguing and spark different ideas. I'll then pose questions collectively. So I'll kind of ask things and point out, and this is again something that runs through the whole presentation and everything I do, is to stress that a lot of writing, whether it's creative writing or maybe if you're doing kind of investigative news type writing, it's all about asking questions. So I'll ask of an object, for example, what do you think it is? It might not actually be obvious what it is. Where does it come from? Whose does it belong to? Does it have any special value? Maybe it's got monetary value. Maybe it's got sentimental value. Maybe it's got special powers. Who has the object? Who does it belong to? Does somebody want the object? Why? And basically through asking these questions, a story will start to form for them to write up. So then the next stage would be for them to, I'd provide a worksheet like the one you can see on the screen, which kind of sets out those different questions. So then students can either work independently or maybe in small groups to develop their own story. And you can obviously use this multiple ways with different kinds of objects. You can theme it different ways, but basically through this, you get that initial spark of inspiration. And then through the workshop, you start to get a structure of the story. Another way to spark inspiration, which is a popular one I'm sure you've already used and you're aware of, is to use story starters. It's a really commonly used tool. And again, if I'm doing this as a workshop, I will actually do this collectively. So I might read out a title and ask students to suggest to volunteer their ideas for a story that could be sparked by that title or that opening line. We'll take one example here, which is from You Can Write Awesome Stories. So let's look at Help, My Little Sister's a Snake. And for that, I'll sort of ask them to tell me how they think the sister became a snake, or was she already a snake? Has she always been a snake? What happens to her as a snake? And then you can start to build the backstory. And then you can ask about the little sister's character. What sort of person is she? What happens to her as a snake? How does it affect you as her brother or sister? And I'd also sort of frame it in the context that there's no right or wrong answer. This is all about sort of freeing up the imagination. You can kind of worry about the nuts and bolts of structure and plotting and things like that later. These are just designed to free up the imagination in the first place. And then I'll ask students to suggest their own opening lines. And it's quite nice if you kind of, kids can write their own and then maybe swap it with a partner, just to mix things up a bit. And then I might provide worksheets again for them to kind of start to get a structure to their short story. Very similarly, you can use awesome endings to spark stories, spark story ideas. So let's use an example here. Again, from You Can Write Awesome Stories. Remind me to never ever wear granddad's wig again. So that's kind of quite a fun one to do with younger pupils, and just really prompting the question, what on earth happened when the character wore granddad's wig? So it's again this idea of asking questions, and in a way I quite like the awesome ending one's nice because you're working backwards through the story. It's again introducing that idea of writers being like detectives. So it's asking questions, in this case trying to figure out what led up to this situation. One more way of sparking inspiration is really through using flash fiction. It's a great warm-up exercise that frees up the imagination, and you've got a sense of urgency that comes from being under pressure, having a ticking clock against you. So I like to call this the 3-word 5-minute frenzy. Again, I might do this collectively, and I might kind of come up with 3 random words: a pineapple, a policeman, and a fridge, and ask students to think about what might connect those 3 apparently unrelated items, and set the clock. You've got 5 minutes, no time to procrastinate, no time to worry about what you're going to write, just get on and do it. And then obviously you can mix that up with different words. Students can come up with their own crazy combination of words for a partner or the rest of the class to work on. Again, it's fostering that idea of collaboration through actually inspiring story ideas. So the next key thing I would cover through a separate workshop for our creative writing magazine is to talk about the importance of characters, and I'll do a few set of activities around that. And this would all be framed with the fact that characters in stories, like people in real life, are really at the heart of it. I sort of explained that as in real life, fictional characters are what make life interesting. They're what make the story, that they give the stories their impact, just like in real life. And I'll also explain that characters being the key ingredients, they're what bring the stories to life, they're what keeps readers reading, and they will make readers care about your story. So again, talking about integrating that idea of the importance of audience. One way to spark ideas for creating characters, I do again quite a practical type activity where I'll bring in different props and costumes, whether it might be hats, glasses, different shoes, capes, bits and pieces, or if you don't have that stuff available, you can kind of use different photos from a magazine. And then I'll ask other students to ask questions: who are you, where are you, what do you do, what kind of person you are, and try to build up a character profile of that person. And I think it sort of helps to make it almost like or to make it a visual activity, whether you do it with costumes or you do it through looking at magazine images or any sorts of images you want to use. And I think making it visual helps, whether you do it either way. It kind of makes it real, and it's also the idea of collaborating. You're not kind of sitting on your own thinking up a character. And then this same prompt you can do multiple times. In fact, the same prompt might create 50 different characters. And I think that's a good way to show how unique everyone is, and would get back to the idea about writing being a way of showing who you are. And then leading on from that, after we've done our kind of costume-based activity, I'll ask students to fill out character profiles, which similarly in the way that we had the worksheets for the object activity, from this asking things like name, age, appearance, occupation, and maybe drawing a picture as well, you start to build a sense of who that person is. Leading on from that, I think it's really important to introduce the idea of empathy and explain that empathy is a really key skill for writers, just as it's a key skill in real life. And really, to get to the heart of a character, writers have to stand in other people's shoes. They have to get inside their heads. They have to understand how other people think. And of course, that translates from when you're doing short stories in creative writing, that would also translate when we come to look at non-fiction activities. So around this, I might ask students to write a Dear Diary day in the life of somebody based on a character that they've created a profile for. And you can sort of flip it around and also get them to write from the perspective of a character in a book that they're not that keen on. So maybe the baddie, just to show really that writers have to get under the skin of all kinds of characters. Moving on from that, a few activities around what I call word wizardry, making magic with adjectives. And then we'll move on to similes and metaphors. So I guess once, again, just to stress that we're building up a toolkit here that will be useful for the creative writing magazine, and it will be useful for non-fiction projects. So in terms of activities around adjectives, we're building things up in layers here. So they've already created character profiles from the previous examples and activities I gave. What they can do now is to flesh out those character profiles with more magical words, using word wizardry to describe their character's appearance and personality. And in this, I will ask them to really consider all the senses. It's about making their writing magic, making their words sing from the page. So thinking about the obvious things, how characters look, but also thinking how they might smell, how their hair or skin feels, how they move, how they sound. So all of those things about them. And then moving on to their inner life as well, what kinds of characters they are. And I will give the context and purpose of this as being, this will make your character more real. It will make them more convincing, which ultimately will keep your readers more interested. When it comes to introducing things like metaphors and similes, I like to play the musical metaphors game. So again, I might gather an assortment of objects into a bag. You'll see I kind of like to use objects quite a lot. They really are a brilliant springboard. So I will have a bag of objects, 6 students in a circle, and we'll play a sort of musical, I pass the parcel, I'll pass the bag around the circle as music plays. When the music stops, the person holding the bag must blind pick an object and invent a simile or metaphor inspired by it. So they're just some ideas of how really to build up different elements of creative writing. But of course, once you've got your idea in the first place, and once you've got your characters, or you're aware of how to create characters, and you know how to make your writing magic through word wizardry, the next thing you need to know about is structure and plotting. And again, this applies obviously to creative writing, having a beginning, middle and end, but it also applies to good non-fiction writing, which also needs to be well structured in order to keep readers reading. So to talk about plotting and structure, I use the template of what I call the mountain map adventure. And I'll kind of go through what stories need in terms of they need a beginning where you introduce your characters and setting. Then you need a bit of build up, you need to start creating tension, the mountain's getting steeper. Then at the first mountain peak is where your character has to encounter their first problem, then they overcome it, they resolve it. And then to keep that tension, to keep readers reading, you might give your character a second setback, which will be even trickier to overcome than the first. They have to really dig deep. You really find out what sort of person your character is as they build to the second resolution. And then, of course, at the end of their journey, you might decide to have a happy ending where your character is totally safe, or you might leave it on a cliffhanger so you could write a sequel. It's really thinking about how you tie your strands together. So I will then use this mountain map structure. I will give them a template with the different elements marked on it and ask them to plot out their story onto the mountain map. And I'll relate that to the idea of writing adventure stories, which tend to have ups and downs, gripping plots like a mountain range. And I'll also explain that adventure stories force characters to face obstacles, which are what keeps the story exciting. So yeah, and from having that template of the mountain map, which you can easily create and mark on it the various stages and ups and downs of the journey, they can write their own adventure story. And I would prompt them to think about characters, to think about characters' motivations, to think about atmosphere, to then go back and really jazz up their writing using their word wizardry skills. The other element, moving on now from creative writing to critical writing, which can also be part of your creative writing and book themed magazine. So it's book related, it's creative writing related, but it also introduces the idea of writing critically. As an initial activity, I would ask students to read different book reviews to get a sense of what they should include and the style of book reviews. And Love Reading for Kids.co.uk is a really great source for this. It's got literally thousands of reviews of different children's book. And then after they've kind of done their research, I like students to write down what they think a book review needs, thinking about, did the review make you want to read the book? Why or why not? I'd ask if they agreed with how the reviewer described the book. Why or why not? I'd ask them to analyse what information the review included and what it didn't include. And then I'd point out that reviews should never include spoilers. Right. And then I would actually, after they've kind of done that themselves and they've started engaging with the process of writing book reviews and understood what they're for, I would just run through some basic tips of what they need to do. Firstly, summarise the story, but make it succinct, and also make it personal. And I would ask them to consider lots of questions as they write the review. What was their favourite part of it and why? Who was their favourite character and why? Where and when did the action take place? Did the author make you feel like they were inside their story world? This is asking them to look at the style of writing and how successful it was. And I also think engaging with books in this way through thinking critically and writing a review will help them when they come to write their own stories. And again, did the story make you want to keep turning the pages, or was it boring? How did it make you feel? Did the writing style create any strong images? All of these questions will help them to think about how writers create books, to think about what the book meant to them and what good writing is. And as I said, it will hopefully inform their own writing. And in terms of writing their own book reviews, I will also say the benefits of making comparisons with other books. For example, you could say, this book reminded me of a mashup between Horrid Henry and Diary of a Wimpy Kid. It kind of helps them to engage with their readers, and it also asks them to think about different styles of writing. I will also say that, as with their own short stories, when they're writing reviews, they should try to make the reviews magic, to make your readers as excited about the book as you were. So, for example, you could say, this book was as exciting as whizzing down the world's wildest road coaster. So that kind of introduces the idea that you don't have to reserve word wizardry for your short stories. You can introduce them into other types of writing as well. So as an activity based around that, now they're armed with all of the tips that you need to write a book review, and now they've actually engaged with reading book reviews, you can ask them to write their own. And to do this, I will often ask them to select and review, firstly, a book they loved. It might be the favourite book of all time. It might be the most recent book they've read and loved, and also a book that they didn't like. And I'd ask them then to read the reviews aloud to the class. So again, it's the idea of collaboration, and writing can be a public activity. And then I would engage a class discussion as to why they would or wouldn't read the reviewed book, again, to show the purpose of reviews. So we're now moving on to project 2, a school literary festival. And in terms of this, the overview, what it's for would be to showcase students' creative writing. It can also be used to showcase students' hosting and interviewing skills, which in turn would then boost confidence and social skills. It becomes a public event. Another reason, it can provide entertainment for their peers. You could do it as a class, or it could be across the whole school. The audience, moving down to the bottom of the slide, the audience would be their peers, maybe parents, maybe other schools, maybe the local community if you get the local press on board and invite them. So you can really see it's got multiple purposes. As for the components of it, as some suggestions, we've just gone through different ways. You can actually really springboard from the creative writing magazine that we've just covered. So the content of the magazine could be delivered publicly at live events at the literary festival. So you could have maybe a live poetry slam, or story writers can read their work aloud. And then you can also have students being interviewed by each other about how they were inspired to write their story, about what their story is about. You can also open things up a bit more and have a marketing copywriter to write a newsletter about it. So then you're introducing another element to their writing toolkit. You can also have designers and illustrators can make posters to advertise it. So really we're back to the idea it's inclusive, and a literary festival can have roles for all, and also that it's collaborative. Another thing you could do to kind of make this even more of an event, and to make it something even bigger, you can invite a children's author to be part of it. It might be a local author who can easily get to your school to be part of it. It might be someone whose book they've reviewed for the creative writing magazine, because obviously you could either do this in person or you could host it online. And an extra activity related to this is that you could ask students to write a letter inviting the author to the event. So this introduces persuasive writing. So they would have to explain clearly to the author why they want them to visit, what's so good about their festival, what's so good about their school, and why they've invited this particular author. So I think that's quite a nice activity, number one, so you can potentially have a children's author at your festival. And number two, it encourages students to write in a different way. And again, it's writing for a purpose, the purpose being they want this author at the school. And to do that, you can simply use social media to reach out to authors or contact their publisher. And also the beauty of this, you can keep the project going post the festival. So you'll have had a long while building up to it, a long while organising it, with the students being responsible for different roles. Once the big day is over, you can ask students to write a report of the festival. So again, this is adding writing factual, non-fiction writing to their writing toolkit. If you hosted an author event, students could review the event. They could also write the event up to create an author profile or an article. Again, we're showing different styles of writing here, and hopefully they'll be feeling inspired and buoyed up by the fact that they've had the author in school. As for the reasons for this, well, all of these post festival activities, all of the work that comes as a result of these could be published in a school newspaper, which leads us on to project 3. Creating a newspaper is a really great way to give students agency and ownership and an audience. And why I especially love newspapers, perhaps even more so than the creative writing or book-led magazine, is that it's an even broader way for students to explore different kinds of writing, alongside things like design skills, editorial skills and research skills. So once again, it's inclusive. You can find roles for everyone, or rather the students can all find a role that they want to do. So leading on from that, I would, firstly, engage them in their own market research. Again, this is going to be their newspaper, their own factual magazine. So I'll ask them to bring in magazines that they love, show and tell their favourite magazines, think about why they love them, think about the content and tone of voice of the magazines, and I'll show a selection of them. So students can then decide what kind of magazine they want to create. And then I would ask them then from that to identify what they want to include. And then from that, you can find out, this is really based on asking students what they're interested in, what they'd like to write about, what are they passionate about, what are their hobbies, and then the content of the magazine or newspaper can really be sparked by that. Then ask them to name the publication, and this is something that can be done collaboratively, so there'll be lots of class discussion as to what the name should be after they've decided what the content is. Next up, of course, you need to assign roles. So this kind of really makes it feel real. You can give them actual job titles and have different writing departments. So you might have the news and facts department and the culture and lifestyle departments. And each of these roles can basically prompt a whole load of different workshops. Let's take news reporter roles. So you could have research sessions where they uncover local news stories and they investigate their own news stories. They'll need to learn interviewing skills. They'll need to learn how to check facts. They'll need how to write to a certain word count. And then thinking about, say, if you've got students who are interested in the ecology or the environment, you could have a team researching what's new in the world of science, or researching maybe latest findings around climate change. They'll need to develop, to write this, it adds another level to their toolbox. They'll need to develop an ability to communicate science in a clear way. So I think this is also another way to introduce other elements of writing. And then, of course, sports correspondence, if you've got some big sports fans or kids, who are really involved with school sports teams. Book reviewers, we've just covered an activity around that. But then anything, whatever they're interested in, restaurant critics, fashion experts, short story writers, and puzzle creators can be quite a good one. Because of course, not every student is hugely imaginative, despite all of the examples and despite the prompts we can give. Some students do just have their minds work differently, and they will actually be better suited to some of these non-fiction articles. And they might also be suited to things like creating puzzles, which is something every good magazine needs. And to take this a bit broader, introducing yet more types of writing, we can have an advertising team. So you could do workshops on copywriting and writing persuasively, asking them to analyse adverts and think about why they think an advert was funny, or why an advert worked, or why it doesn't work. And you can do workshops around that where they have to pick a new product or invent a new product and create an advertising campaign around it. That's another way of writing. It's another way of thinking about words. Of course, a newspaper or magazine would need copy editors, proofreading, people who check the layout. So you need kind of students who are meticulous and would enjoy that kind of details work. And then, of course, you might have students who are better at visual things, so they could design the magazine using their art and tech skills. Related to that, you can run a whole workshop around comic strips. So you'll have students who are really great with art and on the visual side of things, and you can run a whole workshop on creating a comic strip. And I like to, if I'm doing anything with comic strips, I like to frame it in the terms of there being more than one way to tell a story, and explain what's so brilliant about comic strips is that it uses a really clever and often funny combination of words and pictures to tell a story. which is, I think, is kind of a nice way to free up the idea of different kinds of writing, and you might prefer one kind of writing to another. It's a case of finding what you're passionate about. And then also on the school newspaper, you can have a press department who maybe write a press release about the magazine. And from that, you could run a workshop on the purpose of a press release, thinking about what practical information it needs, and also maybe how you're trying to sell it to people. Press outreach work, you could form a relationship with the local newspaper, even maybe inviting a local journalist to come into school to talk to your class or the whole school about what it's like being a journalist. And you could maybe even get them to host a workshop on how they work, on how they write. And again, I think having a real life writer will give real life relevance to the project. And you can also kind of reach out wider to the community, contact local community groups, the local newspaper, other organisations, and engage them, which will help students find things to write about for the project. And it also makes it more real. It also might give it more coverage in the real world. Swiftly moving on to project 4, which is creating a school handbook for new starters. And this really does have a really huge sense of purpose, and there's lots of reasons to create it. So in terms of who it's for, it's about sharing knowledge, it's informing new pupils and putting them at ease. And in terms of the content ideas, I would ask students really to think about what they wish they'd known before they started at school. So it might be things like the booklet would have maps, so newcomers can find their way around. It might have interesting information about school history, when it opened, who opened it. It could have fun profiles of teachers. Perhaps the students writing the handbook could interview teachers and illustrate them. You could have profiles of pupils who've got certain roles in the school. Say you're the captain of the football team, or you're a school librarian. You could talk about the canteen. You could review some of the food at the canteen. You could maybe have some sample menus. You could have information about extracurricular activities that go on at the school. And you could also make it fun. You could have some students could write school jokes or cartoons or comic strips. In terms of practical activities, this really is, in some ways, this might be the best way to give students that sense of purpose and agency, because really they can think about what they wish they'd known before they started school, what they were worried about, what they were excited about, what questions they had. And these could be questions that weren't answered until they started. But of course, their student handbook could really help new pupils have these answers before starting. So once again, they can self-assign roles, thinking about who wants to cover what based on their interests and skills. So I'll just flick back to the content ideas here. So you might have certain students who are really kind of good at thinking visually, so they can create maps to go in the handbook. And you can run workshops around that, which actually gets them to think in a different way as well. You can kind of get them to walk around the school, make a visual map of it, make a mental map of it, visualize it, put it on paper, think about how you mark it up. So again, it's kind of different writing for different purposes and with a very practical application in this way. And again, the idea that it's really inclusive, the school handbook invites all kinds of writing. Moving on to project 5, writing a local travel guide aimed at kids the same age. And again, the idea of this is to add more to their writing toolkit and really introducing and developing new writing skills. So I'll sort of firstly explain travel guides, or the first thing about travel guides, or one thing about travel guides, is that they're informative, they're facts-based and they're practical. But travel guides, and more broadly travel writing, can also be inspirational. They can also kind of evoke the atmosphere of a place, so they require strong descriptive writing. In terms of the travel guide, I'll explain, I would set it in the context of what it's for, which is to share knowledge about your town and to perhaps persuade people to visit. and also to let your readers know practically what to see and do when they visit, where to eat, all of those kinds of things. So again, it's that mix of factual, practical, clear writing, and also the inspirational element. So you might have things like a short overview of your town. You might have top attractions for different ages, top places to eat, top places to walk and enjoy the outdoors, best things to do on a rainy day, best time of year to visit, top historic sites. And again, you'll want to have maps. You might have profiles of local people as well. They might be kinds of people who are celebrities of the area, or maybe people who are well known in the area for doing good things. And in terms of activities for practically getting them to start to write the travel guide, I'd ask them to research and read articles on things like the Rough Guides and Lonely Planet websites. Students then could look at the kinds of things they need to include in their travel guide. I then have class discussions around students' top 10s. They can do local research. It's something that they can do when they're out at the weekends with their friends and family. You could also run class field trips to research content. Linked to this, you could also run writing workshops around adding atmosphere. So explain what atmosphere is. And then you could do an activity that I call Trip of a Lifetime Tale, which I'll ask students to write about a place that means something to them. And really the aim of their story would be to make readers feel like they're in the place, i.e. it needs atmosphere. It might be somewhere they've been or somewhere they want to visit. Project 6, sorry, I'm flying on a little bit now, but all of this will be recorded so you can check back on it. Historic documents. And this basically kind of incorporates a lot of the activities and concepts that we've already covered. Basically, the frameworks that we've used in the newspaper and in the travel guide can be applied to infinite projects. So you could do, as I've got a few examples here, the Aztec News. It's obviously dependent on what particular historic periods you're covering in your curriculum, or maybe it could be related to local history. For example, if you live somewhere where there are Roman ruins, or maybe there are Mayan temples to explore, whatever it might be, you can relate it to the curriculum and to your region. And I think really it's kind of the idea is that the magazines or newspapers would feature contemporaneous features on things like news stories, articles on science and technological developments of the time, whether it's the invention of the wheel or the invention of bikes or the first car, the first train. You could have articles about of-the-moment artists and musicians and books. You could have a review of the latest Shakespeare play that was published. You could have adverts for fashion that was worn in the era. So students could check what the prices might have been, check what people used to wear, think about, and also they could research the food that people used to eat. So you could have restaurants reviews from food that was eaten back in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, for example. You could have recipes as well. And you could also have puzzles, things like crosswords and word searches that might use old languages that they're studied. So I don't know, maybe again, if it might be Latin or ancient Greek or Anglo-Saxon, or if you're studying medieval times, you can kind of bring that in and have fun with the language through puzzles and crosswords. Finally is Project 7. Which is entering competitions. And the reason for this is really it takes us back to where we started, in that competitions have a really clear sense of purpose and strong motivation. Basically, that is at the most basic level, you have to follow criteria. There'll be a word count, there'll be a theme, and you have to work to a deadline to get your entry in on time. Also, motivation comes by having readers. In this case, that will be the judges of the competitions. You can be motivated by the potential to win prizes and also by the potential for recognition. Maybe you win or you get shortlisted. You'll be recognised as a great writer personally, and also it brings kudos to your class or your school. And then there's also that satisfaction of being something bigger, which is something I mentioned at the outset. It's kind of a much bigger scheme. It's a big project that lots of people are involved with. How to turn writing for competitions into projects, into writing projects. Basically, you can build a whole series of writing activities around competitions. So a lot of the activities that I've gone through before, you can, if you've picked a competition that you're going to enter as a class or as a school, that becomes your project. And rather than the magazine or the newspaper, the competition is your project, and you can host a whole load of activities, a whole load of workshops around that. So you could do the inspiration workshops, you could do the every object tells a story idea, you could have sessions on character development, you could do mountain map writing sessions, you could have various word wizardry workshops. So you're building that toolkit with the wider purpose of entering a competition. And one really great example of that is to enter the 2022 Big Cat competition, which is a really major competition that Collins have been running for some time now. And this year's launch is on the 1st of November, and you've got a good long time to enter, not until the end. The entries are open until the end of April. And this year's theme is based around the question, what does home mean to you? So basically sparked by the events of the last year, or the last 18 months, in fact, when our physical home has become so much more important and maybe taking on different meanings. And for this particular competition, non-fiction and fiction are welcome. So students can write stories, letters, poems, and you can see the Big Cat Competition 2022 website for more details on that. And there's some really fabulous prizes, so I'd really recommend it. And as I said before, competitions are a really fabulous way to arm students with that toolkit I was talking about. And you can see some great prizes here, which surely are a great motivator. So that's almost the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to do a quick summary before we open for questions. So basically, coming back to my main mantra, which is writing for pleasure goes hand in hand with writing for purpose. And collaborative projects really foster writing for pleasure. And that really does translate beyond just writing short stories. It translates beyond creative writing. It translates across the curriculum. Projects provide purpose, which means more pleasure, which means improved writing skills and improved communication skills generally. It's about confidence building as well. Projects are collaborative. You get the power of peer-to-peer encouragement and being part of a team. And finally, projects provide agency, which means students are more engaged, more likely to derive pleasure from writing, and their writing and communication skills will generally be improved. So that's everything, and I'd like to thank you for listening. And I think now we can go to questions for the last 5 or 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was brilliant, and everyone really enjoyed it. I can see from the chat box that you've given people some really useful ideas that they're going to use. So I'll just say to everyone that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be sending everyone who has attended today the webinar recording and the attendance certificate for you to refer back to. And my colleague will now paste the link for the attendance certificate into the chat box if you'd like to download it. The recording will also be available on the webinar website. And if you have any queries at all, please feel free to contact us at collins.international@harpercollins.co.uk, which is the email address shown on the final slide here. So we've just got time for a couple of questions. I've had one from Georgiana who says, "Hello, Joanne. I found it interesting that the topics discussed today can apply even for independent writing. Relating to peer-to-peer reviews, what is the best approach to receive an opinion on your own writing, and with who should you ask for that opinion?" And she's also asked about insecurities around writing. So how can you overcome the "I'm not convinced that what I'm writing is good enough" problem? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think confidence can be a huge inhibitor, and which is kind of why I think the collaborative approach works. But I totally understand there'll be some students, or probably a fair number of students, who'd be less confident presenting to bigger groups. So I think it's kind of a good idea then, the peer-to-peer review with less confident students, you can just do it in smaller groups, or it might just be you with the student, or them and one of their close friends, where it's done on a more one-to-one basis. And I think really you can build in the idea of peer reviews if you do, for example, the book review writing activities I suggested. And I think one of the tips, which I probably didn't go into in enough detail, is when students are writing book reviews, so they're doing critical writing, it's kind of important to also be fair to the writer. So it might be that you absolutely didn't like a book, but I think it's important for students to know that the person sitting next to them might have absolutely loved that book. So just in the same way that writing is so personal, responses to books is personal. And so I think that can be a great way to help students realise that it is personal, and no two stories are the same, no two responses to stories are the same. And I think also in time, if students get used to these sort of collaborative, active writing sessions, that can hopefully build confidence, both in terms of their personality and in their writing. And I think actually reading, if students are nervous about reading their own work aloud, it can be a really great thing. There might be a student who actually is absolutely brilliant at writing, but they are nervous, or they don't have the confidence to read it out themselves. Ask one of their peers to read it out. And I think that's where the literary festival could be helpful as well. If a student's too nervous to read out their own work, it can be a real confidence booster to have somebody else reading out their work. So hopefully across this mix of ideas, that can support less confident students.
Thank you, Joanne. We've got one more question as well from Toto. He's said, thanks a lot for lots of ideas, excellent presentation, and has asked, developmentally speaking, our young learners are still building up their vocabulary as well as their concepts about reality, so time and space, etc. He's said, how should we encourage them to put into writing whatever they'd like to without too much concern about plot, grammar, typos, and the like, especially when English is not their first language?
Yeah, that's something I feel really passionate about. I think a lot of students that I've met when I've done workshops in schools are so hung up, or they kind of become almost crippled by worrying about whether their punctuation is correct, or maybe they're not using enough adjectives, or they become so fixed on those sorts of nuts and bolts that it actually hampers their love of writing. So what I always try to stress really is, I think that's actually why I do a lot of things collaboratively and aloud, so people can express their ideas verbally, and with each other they create a story. And that, I think really it's understanding that there's different ways to tell a story. Films are stories, comic strips are stories, and of course ultimately it's great to have a more developed toolkit for the written word, so you will ultimately learn, your vocabulary will ultimately expand, or you'll get more used to writing grammatically correct. In the first instance, I actually sort of say that let's put that aside. What we're going to do is focus on the magic of telling stories and the magic of words, and all those things are important, but they're actually secondary to what a good story is and what a good story does, i.e. how it makes your readers feel. So I kind of really, I know it's tricky, and I'm not a teacher, but I know it's tricky to kind of, you've got to do multiple things at once. So there's the ideas that I've been talking about, writing for pleasure, but you also need to deliver all of that teaching around good grammar and improving vocabulary. But I think if everything is underpinned as far as possible with this idea of it being pleasurable, it's about self-expression, and I think underpinning it with that can help free up the creative side of it.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we've got time for today. But thank you again to Joanne for a fantastic webinar. And thank you everyone for attending today.